Good evening. I am Sandra Hazel Frank, President of Women's Group. Delighted to welcome you to the Women's Group Fall Virtual Event, Suffrage at 100. We thought this would be a great opportunity to celebrate the strong sisters of yesteryear who made voting possible for we women. Especially this year, when getting out to vote and letting your voice be heard is so important to support your beliefs in how we should be governed going forward. We hope you enjoy tonight's program, and you are sure to learn something new about suffragettes. The title Suffrage at 100 leaves out an important word: suffrage at 100 for women. Prior to that, men had been voting in various elections. For clarification, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits the states and the federal government from denying the right to vote to citizens of the United States on the basis of sex. Initially introduced to Congress in 1878, several attempts to pass a women's suffrage amendment failed until passing the House of Representatives in 1919, followed by the Senate passing it. One passed in May and the Senate in June, and then it was then submitted to the states for ratification. The first Unitarian principle is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Every person. Shelter Rock's Women's Group intention is to help right the embedded social attitudes that diminish gender equality. We are fortunate to have a focused group of committed women and men living our UU values by making these issues everyone's concern. There is still much to do. The Equal Rights Amendment that is designed mainly to invalidate many state and federal laws that discriminate against women is central underlying principle was that sex should not determine the legal rights of men and women. That was introduced in 1923, and it is still languishing and has never been passed. When gender bias is removed from the equation, everyone prospers. And now to our presentation, Suffrage at 100, a visual history. Suffragists fought for the vote in every corner of the country. The story of the suffrage movement. The story of the suffrage movement usually starts like this. In July 1848, a group of people got together in Seneca Falls, New York, and set forth a series of demands for women's rights, including the right to vote. But this history of women and voting in the United States extends well before and beyond Seneca Falls.
The Wyoming Territory was the first place in the United States to pass a women's suffrage measure in 1869. Officials there stood firm in their commitment to suffrage, even when it later threatened their petition for statehood. "We will remain out of the Union 100 years rather than come in with the women," they told Congress, which relented and admitted them in 1890. The refrain, "Lifting as we climb," famously used by the black suffragist Mary Church Terrell, became the motto of organizations such as the Arizona Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. A group of suffragists who call themselves the Army of the Hudson prepared to march from New York to Washington, D.C. in February 1913. Led by General Rosalie Jones, the army hiked more than 200 miles in 17 days through mud and slush to deliver a letter to President Woodrow Wilson urging him to support women's fight for the vote. "Remember, we are going through," Jones said. "Let those who fall out return. But remember, our motto is, on to Washington." The suffragist Nell Richardson left, and Alice Burke set off from New York in April 1916 on a 5-month cross-country road trip to rally support for the vote. Along with their cat, Saxon, a gift from a supporter in Mobile, Alabama, they traveled some 10,000 miles in a yellow Saxon roadster they called the Golden Flyer, stopping in more than 100 cities from New Orleans to San Francisco to Detroit, before returning to New York in September. After Congress passed the 19th Amendment, the fight for ratification moved to the states. By the summer of 1920, 35 states had approved the law, and Tennessee became the leading candidate to push the amendment over the finish line. While the suffrage cause had been largely stymied in the South, a biracial coalition of Nashville women's groups successfully lobbied legislators to ratify the measure. It passed 50 to 46 on August 18th.
There was never just one kind of suffragists. Women's quest for political power involved Americans of every race, class, and walk of life, and it did not start or end with the vote.
Black women such as Mary Church Terrell, 8th from the left in the back row, at a conference for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in 1919, often found themselves alone in rooms of white suffragists. Terrell implored organizations such as NAWSA to include more women of color. Seeking no favors because of our color, nor patronage because of our needs, we knock at the bar of justice, asking an equal chance, she said at their 1898 convention. Lifting as we climb. In 1896, Terrell, Harriet Tubman, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Ida B. Wells Barnett, and others formed the National Association of Colored Women to spearhead their fight for equal rights, including the right to vote. The refrain, "Lifting as we climb," which Terrell used in her 1898 NAWSA convention speech, was the organization's motto. For black suffragists, the fight did not end with the 19th Amendment. On the night before the election day in 1920, members of the Ku Klux Klan came to a black girls' school in Daytona, Florida, to intimidate its founder, Mary McLeod Bethune, and other black women in the community from voting. Bethune, pictured circa 1905, was undeterred and cast her vote the next day. Still, many black women and black men across the South would effectively be barred from the ballot by Jim Crow policies, violence and other forms of suppression for decades to come.
Our country now, from thee claim we our liberty in freedom's name. Guarding homes, altar fires, daughters of patriot sires, their zeal our own inspires, justice to claim. Woman in every age, for this great heritage tribute have paid. Our birthright claim we now longer refuse to bow. On freedom's altar now our hand is laid. Sons, will you longer see mothers on bended knee for justice pray? Rise now in manhood's might, with earth's great souls unite, to speed the dawning light of freedom's day.
Latinos, Asian Americans, indigenous women, and immigrants all were part of the multi-generational struggle for the vote. They led marches, gave speeches, and organized for their right to a voice in the political system. But when victory did come with the 19th Amendment, some of them would not be included.
Many of America's newest residents joined the battle for voting rights in the early 20th century. Immigrants, such as the Polish-born organizer Rose Schneiderman, third from right in the front row, with members of the New York Women's Trade Union League in 1909, became powerful advocates, not only for suffrage, but also for workers' rights and child labor protections. Women who came to the United States from nations such as Norway, where they had enjoyed some voting rights since 1907, found themselves disenfranchised in their new home. Many of these immigrants banded together to form organizations like the Scandinavian Suffrage Association of Minnesota, pictured in Washington circa 1917, that helped lead the campaign for the vote in the Midwest. In parts of the country with large Spanish-speaking communities, the fight for the right to vote was bilingual. This flyer, distributed by the Los Angeles Political Equality League, urged voters to support California's suffrage referendum in 1911. Suffragists like Maria de Lopez traveled the state making the case for women's rights. A language instructor at Los Angeles High School, de Lopez worked as a translator during the campaign and stumped for suffrage herself in Spanish. Adelina Otero Warren, pictured in 1923, was an organizer for the NWP who rallied support for the ratification of the 19th Amendment in New Mexico. In 1922, she became the first Latina to run for Congress, vying to represent the state as a Republican in the House of Representatives. Mabel Ping Hua Lee, pictured in 1937, joined the suffrage movement as a teenager, leading thousands of women in a 1912 parade in New York while riding a white horse. But as a Chinese immigrant, she would be barred from American citizenship and the vote until the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943. Many Native American women, such as those in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, had wielded political power since well before the founding of the United States. And later, Native women like the Yankton Sioux activist Zicala Sa, also known as Gertrude Simmons Bonine, pictured circa 1898, joined the fight for women's suffrage, even though many Native American women would not be considered citizens until the passage of the Snyder Act in 1924.
Suffragists fought for their rights, not only at the ballot box, but also in their daily lives. For some of them, that included whom they loved and how they chose to express their identities. The terms gay and lesbian were not used much at that time, but many women who might identify as part of the LGBTQ community today were integral to the campaign for the vote. Several of the most prominent leaders of the suffrage movement were involved in so-called romantic friendships or Boston marriages. that many historians now regard as same-sex relationships. The one-time NAWSA president, Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, and Lucy Anthony, niece of Susan B. Anthony, who was also believed to have had relationships with women. Mary Burrell and Lucy Diggs Slowe, both prominent members of the same circle of black suffragists in Washington as Terrell and Carrie Chapman, Cat, another president of the NAWSA, and Mary Garrett Hay, just to name a few.
The writer and suffrage organizer Alice Dunbar Nelson, pictured circa 1915, documented her relationships with both men and women in her diaries, and described a queer subculture within black women's clubs and the suffragist community. Kraft and her partner, Hay, shown casting their first ballots in New York in 1918, traveled the country, implementing Cat's, quote, winning plan, unquote, to rally the support for the 19th Amendment. Cat had been married twice, but when she died, she insisted on being buried not with either of her husbands, but with Hay. Quote, "Here lie two," unquote. Their headstone in the Woodlawn Cemetery reads, quote, "United in friendship for 38 years through constant service to a great cause."
I have a neighbor, one of those not very hard to find, who know it all without debate and never change their mind. I asked him what of woman's rights, he said in tones severe, "My mind on that is all made up, keep woman in her sphere." I saw a man in tattered garb forth from the grog shop come. He squandered all his cash for drink and starved his wife at home. I asked him, should not woman vote? He answered with a sneer, "I've taught my wife to know her place, keep woman in her sphere." I met an earnest, thoughtful man not many days ago, who pondered deep all human law, the honest truth to know. I asked him what of woman's cause, the answer came sincere, "Her rights are just the same as mine, let woman choose her sphere."
Not all suffragists were women. Male allies were part of women's campaign for the vote from the beginning. Many of them had collaborated with the suffragists in the movement to end slavery in the United States, and they saw the enfranchisement of women as a natural extension of their work to achieve liberty for all Americans. Among them was Frederick Douglass, who published the abolitionist newspaper, The North Star. Its motto was, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren."
When I ran away from slavery, it was for myself. When I advocated for emancipation, it was for my people, said Douglass, who was among the 32 men who signed the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls. But when I stood up for the rights of women, self was out of the question, and I found a little nobility in the act. A scrapbook documenting the activities of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage, founded in New York in 1909 by Max Eastman, who later edited the socialist magazine, The Masses. Counterintuitive though it may seem, there were women who actively opposed the suffrage movement. Some argued that having the vote would make women masculine, disrupt their traditional roles as wives and mothers, and destroy American society. Their fears were illustrated in this cartoon by Laura Foster, published by an anti-suffrage group in 1915. Organized protests did not become a main tool of the movement until the 1900s, but some suffragists were performing acts of civil disobedience well before Paul or Burns entered the picture. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony, pictured circa 1850, was arrested in Rochester, New York, for voting. She channeled her indignation into a speech the following year, quote, "It's downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty while they're denied the use of the only means of securing them provided by this Democratic Republican government." In 1913, the day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, thousands of suffragists descended on Washington for the women's suffrage procession organized by Paul and Burns for NAWSA. Inez Mulholland, a 26-year-old suffragist, led the parade on horseback. 3 years later, she would collapse while giving a speech in Los Angeles and die shortly thereafter. Her last public words were reportedly, quote, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Bowing to pressure from segregationist factions in the South, NAWSA's white leaders told black suffragists, including Ida B. Wells Barnett, pictured with her daughters in 1914, that they had to walk at the back of the parade. Wells Barnett refused and marched with the rest of the Illinois delegation. In January 1917, members of the NWP, who called themselves the Silent Sentinels, began picketing outside the White House. It was the first demonstration of its kind. They would remain there for over 2 years. Their goal, the Washington Post reported in 1917, was to make it, quote, "impossible for the president to enter or leave the White House without encountering a sentinel bearing some device pleading the suffrage cause." The silent sentinels were arrested multiple times and frequently mistreated by law enforcement. In one particularly brutal incident in November 1917, 33 of them, including Burns, were taken to the Occoquan workhouse in Virginia, where they were violently abused. The Sentinel Minnie Quay described her experience in an affidavit about the episode, which became known as the Night of Terror. The NWP issued pins in the shape of a prison door to protesters who had been jailed. The women wore these, quote, "jailed for freedom," unquote, pins as a badge of honor. Survivors of the Night of Terror capitalized on the public's horror at their treatment to sway more supporters to their cause. In 1919, a group of them went on a 16-city tour, the Prison Special, wearing their jailhouse garb and sharing their stories. They called the train they traveled on the Democracy Limited.
From the earliest days of the movement, the suffragists creatively and relentlessly spread the word about their cause. Renowned orators such as Sojourner Truth, Mary Church Terrell, and Dr. Annie Howard Shaw gave speeches. Leaflets and posters made the suffragist case in print. And when the mainstream male-run press refused to cover the movement for women's rights, or did so in disparaging terms and with grotesque caricatures, women created their own. Several of the continent's first publications written by and for women emerged with the suffrage movement, including Amelia Bloomer's The Lily, which Reform, and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin's The Women's Era, the first newspaper published by a black woman in the United States.
Terrell, a prominent black suffragist and the first woman appointed to the Washington, D.C. Board of Education, used her gift for languages. She spoke at least 3, to fight for the suffrage movement and for black women's inclusion in it.
A few leading questions. Underrepresentative form of government, such as ours, who should make the laws?
The people.
Do the people make the laws?
No, 1/2 of the people are forbidden any share in lawmaking.
Who do make the laws?
Men.
Who gave men the right to make the laws?
Men.
Do not the laws concern women?
They certainly do.
May not women take part in making the laws which they must obey?
They may not. Men alone make the laws for women and men.
If a woman transgresses the law, who decides the penalty, tries, convicts, and punishes her?
Men.
Who sit on their juries before whom women are tried?
Men only.
Is this what the Constitution means by the judgment of his peers?
Evidently not.
In a pamphlet published in 1903 by the Rochester Political Equality Club in New York, suffragists rebutted some of the most common arguments against women's right to vote. This cookbook, sold as a fundraiser at an 1886 suffrage festival in Boston, contained thoroughly tested and reliable recipes for cooking, directions for the care of the sick, and practical suggestions. In the preface, its editor, Hattie A. Burr, wrote that she hoped it would go forth a blessing to housekeepers and an advocate for the elevation and enfranchisement of woman. To my Valentine, the rose is red, the violet's blue. We want to vote as well as you. A 1900 Valentine's Day card spreading love and women's equality.
Oh dear, what can the matter be? Dear, dear, what can the matter be? Oh dear, what can the matter be? Women are wanting to vote. Women have husbands, they are protected. Women have sons by whom they're directed. Women have fathers, they're not neglected. Why are they wanting to vote? Women have homes, there they should labor. Women have children whom they should favor. Women have time to learn of each neighbor. Why are they wanting to vote? Women can dress, they love society. Women have cash with all its variety. Women can pray with sweetest piety. Why are they wanting to vote? Women have reared all the sons of the brave. Women have shared in the burdens they gave. Women have labored this country to save, and that's why we're going to vote. Oh dear, what can the matter be? Dear, dear, what can the matter be? Oh dear, what can the matter be? Why should men get every vote?
Suffragists fought for more than just the vote. Women's struggle for the right to vote intersected with many social movements of the 19th and 20th centuries, from abolition to temperance, to labor. It collided with wars and grappled with changing social norms. It even had to contend with a pandemic.
An advertisement for a lecture by the abolitionist and suffragist Sojourner Truth, circa 1878. Among the testimonials to Truth's skill as an orator was one from Mosh, who called her a valued friend and co-laborer. A 1918 cartoon by Lou Rogers. She was part of a contingent of the suffragist movement, including her fellow cartoonist, Blanche Ames, who campaigned for access to contraception. Birth control would not become fully legal in the United States until 1972. Organizations such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, saw laws banning the sale and consumption of alcohol as key to protecting women and children from abuse. Prohibition would go into effect in January 1920, a year after the ratification of the 18th Amendment and 8 months before that of the 19th. Louis Hine, an investigative photographer for the National Child Labor Committee, used his camera to expose the living and working conditions that affected children like this one, a worker at a cotton mill in Lancaster, South Carolina, in 1908. In 1911, a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in New York killed 146 people, most of them women and girls. Organizations such as the Women's Union Trade League, pictured circa 1900, recruited many working class and immigrant women to the suffrage movement by arguing that if they wanted to prevent such a tragedy from ever occurring again, they needed a voice in the political system.
From 1914 to 1918, everyday life was brought to a halt by World War I. Carrie Chapman Catt, the president of NAWSA, believed that being seen as patriotic would help the suffrage cause and throw the group's support behind President Wilson when the United States entered the conflict in 1917. NAWSA would pour considerable resources into the war effort. The silent sentinels continued to picket the White House 6 days a week, demanding the very liberty that the country professed to be defending abroad.
NAWSA sponsored all-female medical units during the war, sending dozens of doctors and nurses to serve at field hospitals on the front in France. When these women returned home, they found themselves waging another war against the deadly influenza pandemic of 1918.
Suffragists transformed Americans' democracy. The 19th Amendment, ratified on August 18, 1920, and added to the Constitution 8 days later, was the single largest act of enfranchisement in the history of the United States. Millions of women cast their first ballots that fall, but the amendment's promise was incomplete. Many American women, including some who had fought fiercely for the suffrage, were still excluded from the ballot box. Many Native Americans were not able to vote until 1924, when the Snyder Act made them U.S. citizens. Chinese immigrants were similarly barred until the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943. And many Black and Latino people who, on paper, had an unequivocal right to vote were functionally disenfranchised for decades by poll taxes, literacy tests, white primary laws, and other forms of voter suppression. It is for this reason that many scholars point to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which barred racial discrimination in voting, as another milestone in suffrage history.
Organizers such as Fannie Lou Hamer, speaking outside the U.S. Capitol in 1965, were instrumental to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Their struggle to make the nation fulfill the promises of the 15th and 19th Amendments for all citizens continues to this day, from battles over voter ID laws to the push for better access to polling places, early voting, and voting by mail. The League of Women Voters was founded in Chicago in 1920 to help millions of women exercise their new right to the ballot. Today, there are more than 700 local chapters of the League in all 50 states. On the day in 1968, when she became the first Black woman elected to Congress, Shirley Chisholm wore white in a tribute to the suffragists. 4 years later, she declared her candidacy for the presidency, making the New York Democrat, pictured at her announcement in January 1972, the first African American from either major political party to mount a campaign for the White House. On August 11, 2020, Joe Biden, the Democratic presidential nominee, tapped Senator Kamala Harris of California as his running mate. She will join Geraldine Ferraro and Sarah Palin as only the third woman nominated for vice president by a major political party, and the first Black woman or person of Indian descent on a major party's presidential ticket.
100 years after millions of American women cast their first ballots, Pamela Harris is one of the 26 women serving in the United States Senate. Another 101 are representatives in Congress, in the House. Women are governors of 9 states, as well as the territories of Puerto Rico and Guam. 4 serve as congressional delegates for American Samoa, the Virgin Islands, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. There is still progress to be made, but all this would be unimaginable if women had not won the right to vote.
I am standing on the shoulders of the ones who came before me. I am stronger for their courage. I am wiser for their words. I am lifted by their longing for a fair and brighter future. I am grateful for their vision, for their toiling on this earth. We are standing on the shoulders of the ones who came before us. They are saints and they are humans. They are angels, they are friends. We can see beyond the struggles and the troubles and the challenges when we know that by our efforts things will be better in the end. They lift me higher than I could ever fly, carrying my burdens away. I imagine our world if they hadn't tried. We wouldn't be here celebrating today. I am standing on the shoulders of the ones who came before me. I am honored by their passion for our dignity. I will stand a little taller. I will work a little longer, and my shoulders will be there to hold the ones who follow me. They lift me higher than I could ever fly, carrying my burdens away. I imagine the world if they hadn't tried. We wouldn't be here celebrating today. I am standing on the shoulders of the ones who came before me. I am honored by their passion for our liberty. I will stand a little taller. I will work a little longer, and my shoulders will be there to hold the ones who follow me. My shoulders will be there to hold the ones who follow me.
I want to sincerely thank you for joining us tonight, and I hope that you've learned from the program some facts that you hadn't known before. I want to thank everybody involved to making this event happen, all of our readers and actors, with special thanks to Maria Cirillo, our Women's Issue Chair, who put this program together, and also to Cat Ripley and Richard Bock for the wonderful music. There will be many programs going on. We have some, and hopefully you will look in the Quest. It's announced every Quest. It's announced in the happenings, and of course, as everybody should know, we have a very complete calendar on our UUCSR.org website. There are going to be virtual events, our women's group, Woman Talk daytime sessions, and our book series, which is very popular, so please join, look it up, and be part of it. And feel free to email us at womensgroup@uucsr.org if you have any program ideas or comments to share with us. Have a wonderful evening, and I hope to see all of you in person sometime very, very soon.
Our country now, from the claim we our liberty in freedom's name, guarding homes, altar fires, daughters of patriot sires, their zeal our own inspires, justice to claim.